to the afternoon portion of the Music Makers session. I'm glad you guys came back. Hope you had a nice lunch. We have some great speakers coming up. Our next speaker is Geof Lipman, and he is the, I believe, some title like the Director of Engineering for Little Bits. How many of you are familiar with Little Bits? Oh, good. A number of you. This is a company created by a woman. Her name is Aya Badir. And she had the idea of making these little electronic components that you could click together magnetically with magnetic connections. And each component was in a little package, and so they could snap together. And I gave one to my daughter, who was like 6 years old at the time. And she was like just doing all sorts of things, twirling knobs, making sounds go up and down, lights blinking on and off. Little Bits is growing like crazy into all sorts of new areas, and I think Geof is going to share where Little Bits is headed and what it means for DIY music and DIY tinkering in general. So let's have a hand for Geof Lipman.
Hello everybody. I'm going to try to do some reading. It's a little slight, but I think it'll work out. So I'm Geof Lipman. I'm the engineering team lead at Little Bits Electronics in New York City. And I'd like to, I guess, give some thanks to Mark Frauenfelder, Joe Paradiso, Adam Shore, Laura Rose Simpson, and my colleagues Peter and Aaron for helping to put this whole thing together. It's been quite a journey. And the presenters today, I gotta say, they're pretty awesome, so I hope I can compete. So I'll just get started here. So technology surrounds us today. We've got smartphones, computers, GPS in your vehicle, home energy management, and all kinds of other sophisticated electronics, robotics, and material science products that connect, communicate, and create and participate with us in our daily lives. And you know, it's gotten to the point where it seems like it's just a matter of time before you've got your refrigerator, you know, emailing the taco copter for guacamole for the next party that you've announced on Twitter. So we're continuously being integrated with technology in the current environment. But even though that's the case, the technology that we use is increasingly difficult for us to understand because of the high levels of integration. Although in the past you could take your stereo apart with a screwdriver and see the individualized parts, that's not really the case today. What's inside an iPad? Even if you could pry open the titanium and glass case, I thought my mic was. Let me try this again. Turn this on off. Check. Test. There. Is that better? Yeah, sorry about that. I must have sat on it. Whoop, is it still on? Maybe I'll just carry it. Nah, that'll work this time. That was a button push. Butt problem. All right. So it's hard to understand. We've got, even if you could pry open the titanium case, the technology in electronics is largely hidden inside integrated circuits and canned modules and things that you can't actually perceive because they're so tiny. Unfortunately, this is, I think, for me at least, a little bit alienating and leads to a sort of a passive consumerist mindset when it comes to technology, where if your phone breaks, you're like, okay, whatever, and you throw it out and it's junk. And this is basically a supercomputer that could land stuff on the moon. So at Little Bits, we believe that people want to understand and have agency over the technology that they use. And our CEO, Aya Badir, founded the company to make electronics accessible without the need for soldering and advanced circuit design skills. We enable makers, teachers, artists, and engineers to quickly and easily utilize the power of electronics in ways that were previously unavailable. And I guess I'll just kind of, for those of you that are unfamiliar, I'll step through a little part of the system to show you how our system works. Okay, good. Little Bits is a growing open source library of circuit modules. And the way that we design these modules conceptually is that rather than put a transistor or a 555 or something on an individual card, what we try and do is encapsulate a function or an interaction, I guess sort of in a similar way to object-oriented programming, where you'll have something like a sensor application or a motor actuator that's on a single card rather than doing the individual components. So it's, I guess we kind of think of it as one level of abstraction higher than that. The color-coded color-coded modules, they snap together with magnets. which makes them easy to assemble and foolproof. And the colors themselves are coded information that tell you how to use and assemble the modules. So I'll step through the color code. You can see the power module is attached to the battery right there, and we call blue is for power. Output modules, this is going to be something like a light or something that makes sound or a motor or something like that that takes information from inside the system and transmits it to the user of the outer world, and that's green. Input is the other way around, where you have a sensor or a switch or something that comes from the outside world and influences the system. And finally, the difficult category is what we call wire, and even though there's a lot of things that aren't actually wire in here, the concept is that these are modules that don't interact with the outside world. They'll do something to internal signals, but you won't be able to see it or influence it from the outside. And you can see the magnetic connectors there in glorious animated GIF action. We like to say that the magic of little bits is that the magnetic connectors make it so easy to learn. And the simple nature of the individual modules make it easy to get started with no knowledge of electronics or soldering skills required. But we sort of feel that the real power of little bits is that it's modular and scalable. You can expose yourself to as much or as little of the technology as you like. Getting started by playing around with a few lights and sensors, you can build your understanding of electronics, and before you know it, you'll be building your own actual assemblies of electronics. And in this case, at Moogfest, probably synthesizers, I would guess. And then, so as of today, we launched our new space kit, and the Little Bits universe has grown to 5 kits, 48 modules, and a bunch of cool accessories that help you incorporate them into projects and things like that. So we've built this really awesome, powerful system, but what do we plan on doing with it? Well, in addition to selling it, I guess, we want to put it into the hands of the people and share it with others to help them develop electronics on their own and learn as well. So education and community outreach are a really primary mission for us at Little Bits. We've dedicated a large chunk of our website to enabling an engaged community where our users can share information about what they're building with Little Bits. So a community member will upload photos, videos, maybe lists of parts that they use in order to make, in this case, let's say a jack-o'-lantern, an electric toothbrush, alarm clocks, things that you want to use in your daily life, but you're making them yourself instead of going out and buying a product. We are open source hardware. And what that means is that we don't keep secrets about our designs from the public, and I think this is a really important point. If you want to take one of our designs and incorporate it into your own electronics, please do that. And if you think that you can improve one of our designs, by all means, please do it. And perhaps maybe more importantly, if you want to learn how we did something, like if something that is one of our products is compelling in some way, and you want to learn how, then please go to our website and study the schematics, which we publish on our website. They can be hard to find. You go to the product page and click on the PDF links. But we publish our schematics so you can just copy them and rip them off if you want. We encourage that. If we've done our jobs right, then hopefully, by the end of the day, you'll ask some questions on our community pages and pursue your interests, maybe through other resources on the internet, and you'll end up becoming the electronics designer that you want to be. Okay, so I've said that the power of Little Bits is that it's modular, and I think that's a little bit like duh at Moogfest, because the Moog system has been modular since the 60s, so no big revelation there. But as it turns out, the modern technology community is just starting to discover the benefits and the potential for modular systems that we see nowadays. Some examples would be like Project Ara, which is, no kidding, if you haven't heard of it, it's a modular smartphone that you snap together the little pieces to make your own custom smartphone. That's a pretty cool thing. You've got a lot of cool products like Cublets and Lego Mindstorm, so robotics that's modular, and Internet of Things home automation products like Twine, SmartThings, and others, where they're using the concept of modularity to build powerful and flexible systems that can scale and become really custom tailored for an application. And of course, little bits where all we do is we build modules, that's all we build. And so modularity is really our thing. And so even though it's simple to get started, the system as a whole is deep. So you can develop functions and interactions that are sophisticated and unique. So I'm going to run through a few samples of what people are making. Some of these we did at little bits, and others are provided by our community. We've got logic stuff, so you can get some OR gates, some AND gates, put them all together with a latch, and you've got a 2-bit adder, right? So a 2-bit adder is child's play pretty much, but you can keep adding logic modules as much as you want to produce arbitrarily large logic circuits and state machines, some pretty sophisticated controls, you'll see. Here's the fun part. We have wireless modules, which enable remote control cars, things like that. This is the audience participation part of the show too. So I've got a wireless transmitter here, wireless receiver there, a couple of sensors, and I can control a remote synthesizer, little tiny microsynth right at the front of the stage. So I'll pass this around the audience so you guys can heckle me electronically as I go through the rest of the presentation. There's 2 little circles. You squeeze the circles, pinchy, pinchy, like that. Okay, what else have we got? We've got motors, sensors, all modular. These sophisticated designs, they enable awesome projects like some of the stuff that I'm about to show you. I didn't rehearse this. This is good though. I like it. At Little Bits, we made a slot machine. So we had to. This has a bunch of motors to control the drums. We've got a bunch of logic circuits that can tell you when it reaches the jackpot, and then in the end, we've got to dispense candy at the end, like everything else that we do. So that was a fun project. This is a really cool project. An educator uploaded. It's a brine shrimp hatchery bio project where they use the transmissivity of light in a bottle in order to determine the proper salinity level for maximum brine shrimp breeding. He's got like a DC motor for agitation, light sensors, some logic control. It's a really interesting project. These are on our website if you like. This is a remote control car, which is, that's an obvious and really cool application for the wireless. I kind of think that the audience heckler is a little cooler. And this, by the way, this design was basically inspired by another posting by a community member of ours who in our SynthKit contest had one component that was pretty similar to this, so I kind of ripped it off and then made it remote control because it sounded good. Whoa, that's loud, all right. And then there's the line following robot. Line following robots are usually things that are made with microcontrollers that involve, get some sensors, program something together to dictate its behaviors. But in this case, the thing that I really love about this project is that this project has absolutely no programming in it whatsoever. And it's a really good, it really does a good job of following lines, probably as good as any of the microcontroller-based designs. So this uses light sensors, it uses LEDs, some logic, and some motors. And you've got a line following robot that you can snap together in 5 minutes without having to load a line of code, which to me I think is really great. It makes it a lot easier to get started. And then, I guess the thing that's the coolest thing is that Little Bits and Core, you've gotten together to make a synth kit, which makes music, which is pretty great. And how awesome is the synth kit? It's really awesome. Korg and Little Bits, we joined forces to build a system with all of the components that you'd see in a full-size modular synth. But instead, this one snaps together with magnets and will fit in your lunchbox. So I'll go through the modules so that you can see what the various functions are available. We have an analog oscillator that sweeps from, that's a misprint. It's from 1 hertz to 10 megahertz, or kilohertz, excuse me, with square and saw waveforms available. The filter is a real superstar. This is a two-pole analog VC filter. It's based on the Korg MS-20 filter, which if you guys have played around with is a really nice one. You can also crank the peaking up until it self-oscillates and have another great sound source. We have a 555-based attack decay envelope module and digital delay reverb to get nice ambient sounds. We have a tiny little keyboard that has a massive 5-octave range. So that's if you've got fat fingers, it's a little hard to use, but it has plenty of range. And a step sequencer, in this case, we have 4 steps. You can gang them together in different ways to get more than 4 steps. You can get 8, 16, however many steps you want, depending on how many modules you need. We have mix and split modules, which are for normal signal routing, what you'd expect them to be. And a random module, which produces either white noise or random sample and hold voltages, all coming out of the speaker module, which has a headphone jack as well. So we built a keytar. It was the first thing we thought of when we did it, because there's a lot of guitar players with little bits, and in this case, we got it backwards, because we put the pitch on the left hand and the modulation on the right, but we're guitar players, so it seemed like it made sense to us. There's some other cool projects that have been done that have been posted by community members on our website. This is going to be what's called the Light Sync Sound Machine, and this is a user who's made basically a wearable with a light on it that they use to modulate the sound in the synth kit. I think this is cool because I like to use light sensors for modulation sources as well. I think Tom was mentioning that as well. They're handy and they get really great theremin-like interactions. So in this case, it's using like a flasher to control the tempo on a micro sequencer, which is kind of cool. And then the next slide, here's a community member is using a smartphone to control the tempo of like a bunch of sequences he's got going. I really like this because it's really awesome flyover camera work that makes it look huge. And it's a cool example of the sequencers, the micro sequencers being used. And he's got 2 synth kits too. It's like the Death Star. It's like Star Wars. Okay. And then last thing, I guess one of my favorite things is to use synthesizers and electronics in a musical context is to find interesting ways to work together in like as a band or in a collaborative way. And this next one is another user who's put together, basically they've synchronized a bunch of them together and daisy chained them all together. I'll just play it so you can see. These are all synchronized using one micro sequencer that's they're using to clock an entire array of performers settings. So I keep these like, if I was doing this, I would try to get like, I put them in a circle so you could just keep going forever. But maybe that's too much. Okay, so that's sort of the state of where the system is now today. To let you know what we're working on to improve capabilities in the future. These things are coming up pretty soon. We're going to be adding to the synth kit things that we don't have currently, but everyone wants, are MIDI controllers, USB audio, extended VCAs and LFOs. We've got loopers, samplers, and all kinds of stuff like that as we continue our partnership with the great people at Korg. So we're going to be expanding as time goes on, more modules will be created. We've also announced the Little Bits Arduino module, which is going to add some pretty powerful programming abilities to the system. One of the workshop that I'm doing tomorrow and the next day, I'm going to be doing some stuff with vocal synthesis, and using all analog modules for something like that is a really daunting control problem that with something like a programmable controller would be much easier. And since Arduino is the maker community programmable controller of choice, we've teamed up with Arduino as well to make that available with the Little Bits magnetic connectors, so you'll be able to snap your Arduinos together and quickly prototype things. The really big thing we've got going on now, I guess, is that there's going to be a cloud module, and the cloud module is going to enable us to connect the Little Bits system directly to the internet. So in the case of doing something with synthesizers, you could collaborate with people, across the planet through an internet link. You could also have a distributed synthesizer that would have tone generation in San Francisco. You could have modulation happening in Paris, and you could have the actual pitch selection being done, I don't know, in Ottawa or someplace like that. So there's some real potential for interesting collaborative work with the cloud module that's coming up. We're going to be building cameras, display screens, MP3 players, embedded computing, robotics, and enhanced sensing and home automation. So the system continues to grow and add really awesome capabilities. And all this cool stuff doesn't really do anything without having people working on it. So really, if I were to rephrase that, I would say that the power of Little Bits is really that the user is the designer. And the machine works for you, it's optimized by you, and I wrote this down because this is a cool transition. This type of enabling technology in the hands of the people will lead to new and better machines, maybe even machines that can talk. I rehearsed that transition. So the workshop that I'm going to be doing is going to be all with the synth kit, and basically what I'm doing is I'm going to be talking about human vocal synthesis. And it's a really interesting and challenging task, but in the end you'll end up making things that make robots talk. So we'll be discussing the model of the human vocal tract and its various sub-functions, and how to simulate those with electronics. So what we'll be doing first is building an actual electronic analog for the human vocal tract. It's not necessarily going to be the best one ever, but it'll be intelligible. And the principles are extendable to a lot of different ways of controlling it. We'll be discussing how vowels are formed, how to make filters that will make vowels, and how to control them in this case, with step sequencers that we'll be using. We're going to be talking about the control path, and as I said, this is really the more challenging part of it because you need to have the consonants come first, the vowels come second, and the timing between those two events is variable from word to word, from syllable to syllable. So it's a real challenge from a control standpoint. We've got timing and control path issues that we're going to solve. Then the nuts and bolts of actually building the thing. We're going to have 10 workstations with, I'm guessing, around 40 modules each that we'll be putting together. The consonant generator is what this is. We'll be building the vowel generator, which is that. And then assembling the complete vocal synth. So this is a picture of, I guess I would call this the minimal vocal synth, because we'll be adding some components to this as well to make it a little more lifelike as we go along. So it's going to be a fun project. That's Friday and Saturday. And in the end, everyone is going to be able to make a machine that can talk. Oh. Can you hear that? And of course, Autobahn, right? The classic.
That's too fast.
So, I guess the last thing is that we're going to be giving away synth kits as well, so please show up for the workshops. We're going to select 5 games each time, and you'll get to go home with a synth kit and make your own synthesizers. That's pretty much what I've got, so thank you very much.
So taking a look at the way that Geof was demonstrating those snap-together components, I was thinking about our next guest. What if you had snap-together components and one was labeled mad scientist, and the other one was labeled artist, and the other one was labeled terrifically nice guy? You snap them together. What you get is our next guest speaker, Drew Blanke. He goes by the name Dr. Blankenstein. He lives in New York and he makes incredible digital and analog musical creations. He's sold them to tons of famous musicians, and he's just a delightful person. I think you're going to love him and the stuff that he has. So let's give a round of applause for Dr. Blankenstein.
Thank you, Mark, for that great introduction. Thank you guys for being here. It's a pleasure to be here. My name, as you know, is Drew Blanke, Dr. Blankenstein. At least that's the name I make my creations under. I'm a circuit vendor, developer, graphic artist, and just general media artist, and anything techie I got to have a piece of over the years. One of the things I'm known for, as Mark mentioned, is finding people who are major influences on my life and kind of cornering them and giving them a piece that I feel is a representation of that influence. And it's done pretty well. I mean, keeping consistent with our event here. One of the first times I did this was Kraftwerk, when they kicked off the 3D thing in New York, the Museum of Modern Art, and I managed to get a quad oscillator synthesizer working with the whole 4 thing in Kraftwerk. Here at Moogfest in 2012, I gave Square Pusher a Bit Crusher. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that, but Tom Jenkinson, great bass guitar player, amazing noise composer, and that's pretty much where he influences me the most. Is he really, him and Warp Records, who's actually also doing a showcase here, a lot of their artists had a way of using these non-synthesizer tones and getting them to work harmonically together, which is important to me because I feel like circuit bending is in a great period right now and it's exploding and it's important, and a lot of people who have never even thought of building an electronic instrument are doing it. But on the different side of it, it's important that people are still remembering. This happened with Bob Bokla and Bob Moog with the East Coast, West Coast thing. It's important that they still turn into instruments. You know, they can be tuned. So for me, when you lose melodic control, I try to add rhythmic control. You lose control in something sonically, give some other control back. Tying into with the modifications I actually did today, this is my invention. Really super designed, as you can see. But I call this the Illumaringer, and this was inspired by Trey Anastasio, the lead guitar player from Fish. And he used to do this is going back many years now, he used to do this thing, he still does actually, where he lifts his guitar over his head, and the higher it gets, the higher the pitch, the lower it goes, the lower the pitch, and to the audience it almost seems like the guitar is like a theremin. But it's not. He's using a Digitech whammy pedal, and he's just getting at the feedback and controlling the pitch of that oscillation. So I had the idea that it would be really great if there was actually an effect that would respond to that movement, and then theatrics could be put into a show, you know, without faking it. You know, why couldn't we actually? So this stuck in my mind for many years until I started to get back into circuitry again, and I developed that effect, and I think I got it to a point that I was satisfied, and I gave Trey the pedal. But the bigger thing that happened, and this is really important just for anyone who's maybe starting out building or is already building, is when you build a great effect, a lot of people tend to just put it in a box and love it, and that's it, and they move on to building their next schematic. And I feel like they miss a lot with that. Because this was an effect I worked hard on, and I like the way it sounds. So the reason why it's in this little contraption over here is so that it can be applied to anything. You see, some of these devices are small. The calculator that I modified for today, I had to put it in a box, but still, circuitry is shrinking out of our hands. SMD circuitry is a surface mount. Those are the circuit boards when you open stuff up that are just absolutely tiny. And those are harder to hack. You run into a bigger risk of breaking it. And breaking stuff doesn't inspire people to keep building. So my idea with this was, it's a device that no matter if it's something from the 80s that you could get in there and actually bend, or, I mean, you can attach this to an iPhone. I mean, you wouldn't want to do that to your new iPhone, but I'm saying if you have a piece of electronics that would normally have been thrown away at this point, and there's really not much modifying you can do, this saves that from a landfill, and it's super easy to install. So the idea is people grab these from me, and sometimes and often people don't even know what they're going to put it into, but it allows you to just pick anything in your house that you're going to, if it's a baby toy that's going to get thrown away, or it might be an old guitar that you're sick of, bought a newer guitar, this brings life back into devices. So what I did today is I took some of the pieces that Kraftwerk did a pocket calculator with, and some of you guys will be familiar with those tones, and you can hear what happens to those. And these are the original instruments for the most part, minus this guy I built from scratch, and the pocket calculator is a little bit different than the one they use. But you can hear massive, massive difference in sound with a tiny, tiny little effect added that didn't cost a lot of money. And I'm going to actually go into that. That was kind of the theme of, if I get anything across to you guys today, it's small electronic beats having a massive effect on music. Now that could be a little device like this, having a massive effect on just a little device for yourself, or on a bigger, on the grand scale of it, I want to talk about transistors. And trust me, when they were developing the transistor, it was to eliminate vacuum tubes and huge rooms of tubes. It certainly wasn't to build synthesizers. That was not the first thing in their mind. Science works like that. You don't know where you're going, until you get there. So I actually outlined that story a little bit, which it's going to come to 3 stages in the timeline since the development of the transistor that no one could have ever guessed was going to happen, but change music in ways that I sit around and think about, and I think people still haven't really caught grasp of how big this change is. So when you hear it in this timeline like this, it'll make be a little bit clearer. So 1930, Alan Wilson develops the band gap theory, which pretty much means that he theorized, we're talking no material, theoretical physics, that a semiconductor might be able to be used as an amplifier. No idea how that was going to really happen. So 15 years or so later, on December 23rd, 1947, John Bardeen and Walter Bratton pull off this feat and get a gain of about 15 from a semiconducting device about this big that they built over, with years and years of development. So that was a good Christmas for Bell Labs. The age of transistor starts, and absolutely no one cared. So this starts, if years go by, and this is now into play, and then people who need to have access to these little lamps have them. 1954 comes, Texas Instruments releases the TR-1, first transistor portable radio. Still not seeing much of an effect on society because these things are really, really expensive. So the portable radio really turned into an extension of the home radio. So it's mom's listening to classical, dad wants to listen to the ball game. That's it. It's just an extension of the home radio. But on September 9th, 1956, a young Mississippi boy named Elvis Aaron Presley plays the Ed Sullivan Show, and the need for listening to your own music was really developing into a snowball that needed to be met. So the competition for that TR-1 radio was fierce. The price, whenever competition gets fierce, the prices go down, these transistors became more available. Guess what? Kids got transistor radios now. What's that mean? For the first time ever, since music had been recorded, kids can go off and listen to their music away from the watchful eyes of mom and dad. This is important. Now they're at the river with a stolen six-pack, listening to sexy old Elvis and having a good time. Whereas before, you listened to what your parents had. I mean, your radio was a piece of furniture in the living room. You certainly weren't running out into the woods with it. So with that little plastic device with 3 legs on it created rock and roll and teenage rebellion. All right, so we're getting somewhere with this transistor, right? 1961, Electronics magazine publishes a transistor theremin penned by, guess who? 26-year-old Bob Moog. The caption read, "Build this self-powered 3-octave instrument that will bring music from the ether." That's actually where the term ether wave comes from. People were so confused by how an instrument like that would work, they literally thought the music was coming from the ether. To be honest with you, I feel a lot of people still are confused how the instrument works and things that come from through the ether. So, but more importantly, that was Bob's. He had fetishized the theremin since he was a young boy, and this was really one of his first transistor synthesizers, and he's giving away this this design in the magazine. But around 1964, as many of you guys know, him and Herb Deutsch started working on the Mini Moog synthesizer, which was years later until that finally got developed. How were they able to do this? Is not necessarily transistors, something else happened to transistors around that time. The space program, the Apollo space program, the need to, so we had taken those vacuum tubes and we had shrunk them down into tiny resistors. In order to do anything seriously complex with that network of switches and power amplifiers, they still need to be wired together. So even though you shrunk that big room of yeses and nos or amplifiers down to this big, you literally had the hand wire leg to leg, which is not the way you want to send someone into outer space. Okay, you don't want to be in the moon figuring out where the blue wire goes and 15,000 transistors. So what had to happen is all these transistors needed to be squished down into a one chip so they could be used more efficiently and they wouldn't fall apart on people and break. Now, they pulled this off, because it takes something like a war or the government to really push forward scientific, so it starts in its infancy stage, and you got these guys, brick and mortar trying to build this transistor, and they pull it off, and all of a sudden, the government comes out of the woodwork for uses for this thing and expand on it. So they made this what they integrated circuit, this IC chip. Now that IC chip, at the time, was selling for about $100. The only people who would really spend the money for something like that would be like Bob Moog, who's going to experiment with it and see if it could be worked into a synthesizer situation. Thank God he did. Because as we know, he continued, Bob continued building synthesizers, and we had the module synthesizer that, developed over the 60s, throughout the 60s, and really huge. Mostly that hugeness of the synthesizers because of the lack of IC chips. Boards had to be built bigger. This is why we're not seeing the keyboard yet, okay? Now, good things happen with that modular synthesizer. Let's not downplay that. We're the people who love those things. One of the biggest things was 1968, Wendy Carlos released Switched on Bach, which was completely composed on an all modular Moog synthesizer. But the shocking thing is it got within top 10 of the Billboard charts by 1969 and sold over 500,000 copies. This became the first classical music to sell over 500,000 copies. So here we have a style of music that's been around for hundreds of years suddenly becomes marketable to people when played through that tiny little piece of plastic with 3 legs on it. So we've seen the transistor change the delivery of music, which changed society. Necessarily made it possible to listen to whatever we wanted to, wherever we wanted to. And then now we're taking old music and we're actually playing it through those transistors, and it's turning on. Selling classical music in 1969 couldn't have been the easiest thing in the world. So the IC chip, the price drops, early 70s, thank God. What do we get? Mini Moog synthesizer, $1,500 multi-section synthesizer about the size of a suitcase. Okay, this is where things start getting really interesting. Who purchased this synthesizer? One of my personal favorites, and maybe yours. Ralph and Florian from a krautrock band named Kraftwerk bought one of those Mini Moog synthesizers, and I believe a Synth A sequencer. And with that inspiration, they produced Autobahn. Now, Autobahn to me was a proverbial ribbon cutting to the electronic music genre in total, We're talking about a krautrock band that before that was struggling to get the sounds in their heads out in front of a crowd, and by using flutes, using strange stringed instruments with mics put all over it. Obviously there was something they were hearing in their head that they wanted to play with, and then boom, within a couple of years they got this Mini Moog synthesizer. And once again, that tiny little piece of plastic, 3 little wire legs on it, we went from music delivery. This is all within 20 years of each other. The music delivery changed. We're playing old music through new technology, and now we have an entirely new type of music developed based on that technology. This is when Shockley was trying to build that transistor, he wasn't thinking we need techno in the world, right? So the 70s continue, and Kraftwerk obviously, stuck with these instruments pre-Mini Moog, post-Mini Moog, did what any self-respecting mid-70s audiophile would do and bought all of it. Literally everything. Filled up with their clink-clank studio to the roof with every kind of board and stuff they can get their hands on. So they bring this stuff out live with them. Now, a lot of people know like songs like Showroom Dummies and Hall of Mirrors and stuff like that, and people interpret that because, if you don't know a lot about German culture, you're like, it's a biographical song. But they were actually talking about how everyone else thought of them, because when we're on stage, this massive pile of gear, whereas, Queen is popular at the time. You got guys running across the stage. I mean, these guys couldn't run or else the music stopped. So they looked like dummies, the showroom dummies, and they were making fun of themselves with that. But I feel like it started to frustrate them a little bit, although they had a good sense of humor out of it, and that's a great song. I mean, it certainly developed some inspirational music, robots, and with that in mind, you start thinking about, it starts making sense, post-Autobahn up until the computer world thing was this gear building and the personality of the group shrinking out into a sterilized line, to the point where people wonder if they're even real or not. So how are they going to get away with this? How are they going to change this? This is a krautrock band. It was practically, like a hippie act in Germany, where they would play like in a room like this, where the audience is practically sitting around them, participant kind of audience. And now they're hidden behind a wall of gear. So is it going to be bigger, huger gear that solves this? Absolutely not. That same shrinking transistor is now it's become so cheap that it's going into little devices like this keyboard over here. Let's make sure we got some audio. Oh, actually, we can move this down. How we doing on the house, guys? Forgive me. Actually, forgive them. I need sound, people. No, that was the headphones. Guys? All right, well, I'll continue to figure out that thing. But anyway, so pocket calculators, to talk about that for a second. Pocket calculator is completely composed. We're talking, huge rooms of gear. Now they do a song completely on pretty much twice. This is a Bee Gees rhythm machine, which came out in response to Saturday Night Fever. Pretty much a kid's toy. It's got a 1 flute sound and 3 rhythms. The stylophone, which was popular in the early '60s. I built one from scratch. Uses the same IC chip as the Atari Pong console, the 555 chip, and then of course Casio Pocket Calculator. Now, if you think about this song, if you know it, you think about the lyrics of the song. He's talking about how you're adding, subtracting, and composing on the same device. Right? It's a celebration of the newfound freedom that we're getting from these shrinking electronic devices, because now they're finally able to step out from behind the gear in front of the crowd, and you almost don't even see the devices anymore. It's just it's the complete opposite of what they had done before. And it's made possible by these shrinking, cheapening electronics. Now, how does this tie into me? These shrinking, cheaper electronics are real instruments. And when they're affected correctly and put into a series, they can be used as real instruments. And what else do we know of that you could add, subtract, and compose on? I mean, the smaller, powerful devices, handheld instruments, they were exactly right. We headed full stream ahead directly into that with our devices. Most of us have one just like that in our pocket. So it was really a celebration song of small, powerful stuff, you know? So I'm gonna hopefully play you some of this stuff. Do we have a sound guy here, or should I just sit here and drown on stage? I suppose the latter. Yeah, there's nothing. We got nothing, man. Oh, you got it. Yeah. Someone didn't pull a main in. Okay. Still not getting levels out there, guys. No, it's not on me. Forgive us, guys. Sound check was about 3 minutes. No. No, I was saying make sure we're getting going out. Okay. Something went wrong here, guys. It must be off the board. You guys are really patient, and I appreciate it. Oh no, I think we got it. See that?
No, it's dead.
You sure? I like it. Oh, there we go, there you go. All right, thanks, guys. Oh, that's the sound of music. Woo! All right, well, quickly, because that took a bit of time, I'm going to play the pocket calculator by itself, and I want you to hear my effect. So here it is by itself. That's the ending part. That's the little key part. Now check it out. Remember that illumeringer I showed you? we got Forrest Mims coming up in a second. I'm really excited to see that. I want to keep it moving along. If anyone wants to come up here and play with this stuff a little bit more intimately after, I know we didn't really get the demo I wanted to give to you. Ran into technical problems and stuff, but I'd be happy to let you guys come up here and slam on it and play around. Thank you guys for your time.
Okay, so we have one final guest this afternoon. I'm really excited about this person. I, in 1986, went to Radio Shack, saw a book called Getting Started in Electronics, and I bought it, loved the book. You guys already know who I'm presenting here. He is like a huge inspiration and influence to electronic musicians. Ask almost anybody. When I go to Maker Faire and I tell people, how did you get interested in this? They always tell me, Getting Started in Electronics, Engineer Mini Notebooks by Forrest Mims. He is also the inventor of the Atari Punk console that countless of people have made. Just type in Google image search, look at all the cool Atari Punk consoles people have made. We've got him here today, Forrest Mims. He's fantastic. I am so excited. Let's hear it for Forrest.
It's great to be at a meeting where people know what analog means. Is the microphone working?
No.
Test? Testing? Testing? Okay, right. Thank you. We're going to talk about electronic music, but also a little bit of the background. And I've really been fascinated by some of the background of your presenters here today. It was worth the trip just to hear what I've heard this afternoon and this morning. I feel like a second grader compared to what some of these folks are doing. So we're going to talk about this, and I'm going to give you a little bit of background. First, a couple of acknowledgments. We hear a lot about the 555 and the 556 timer integrated circuit. And the gentleman who invented that is Hans Kamen-Zinn. He was a consultant for Signetics. He didn't just design the circuit. He actually designed the silicon chip itself that the circuit was built on. So the man was a real genius. He also designed many other integrated circuits, the 567 tone decoder, the 565 phase shift oscillator. The man was a real genius. So those of us who build 555 circuits owe him a lot. And then I'm going to show you some music algorithms at the conclusion. And the gentleman here, Jonathan Middleton, and his students are the ones who devised that program. And then the editors and publishers that are willing to publish do-it-yourself electronic music projects, Make Magazine, obviously, and then even going back to the beginning, Popular Electronics, Radio Electronics, Computers Electronics, and magazines like that really gave us a big start. Otherwise, I would have been working in my garage like the rest of you, but with people like Mark and these other editors willing to take a risk with publishing electronic music, we were able to advance. So now I'm going to a little fancier title for my talk here. And when I first got started in electronics by building crystal radios. My dad built one, and my brother and I then copied those radios, making them a little bit simpler using diodes instead of pieces of quartz crystal that my dad used. Then in 1954, we just heard a wonderful history of the transistor and its invention at Bell Laboratories. 1954, National Geographic magazine, in the July issue, had an incredible article called New Miracles of the Telephone Age. And I was 10 years old at the time, but I read that article again and again. It was absolutely fascinating. And I saw pictures of transistors and solar cells and a radio powered by solar cells. It was absolutely amazing. That's what really captivated me. 1957, I built my first transistor radio. Somebody mentioned Elvis Presley. I think the previous presenter. The first song I heard when I turned my radio on, when I finally got it working, was Don't Be Cruel. My dad was in Korea at the time. My mother said we could each have $10 for Christmas, that she's willing to spend that much. I asked for $10 of electronic parts from Lafayette Radio, and those are the parts for that radio. And then 1966, a project I did not build, but I found it in a TV repair shop. These were called code practice oscillators. They cost 99 cents a piece. I bought several of these, and that was my introduction to electronic music. This would make a 2 kilohertz tone that connected to a 6-volt battery, a telephone key, and a little 8-ohm speaker. But it had far more applications than music. So let's spin off of music for a minute. The 2-transistor circuit, I have no idea who designed that. I only saw a similar circuit in the General Electric transistor manual. I don't know who designed it. But I took that circuit and used that to drive an infrared light emitting diode, and then that became a travel aid for the blind. My great-grandfather was blind, and I was very interested in developing devices to help blind people get around. And so I built that in '66, and then that culminated in putting it on eyeglasses about 6 years later. And so the circuit that you saw, that 2-transistor circuit, is in that tube right there, along with the infrared diode. So it's not electronic music, but it used musical tones to convey distance to objects. And blind people have amazing hearing. My grandfather could walk along a country road, and with a tapping and scraping of his cane, he could count the power line poles along the road by the echoes. And he could do lots of other amazing things. And I've had lessons from blind friends, one in particular, teaching me how to do these things that they could do, all requiring capable hearing, able to discern very sensitive sounds. So here's my workbench from the 70s. Some of this stuff was used in building this little 2-transistor oscillator that flashed a light bulb. This is the same circuit I showed you from the 1966 code practice oscillator. And this became my first magazine article. This is in Model Rocketry magazine, September 1969, transistorized tracking light. And with that, a friend of mine, Ed Roberts at the Air Force Weapons Lab, he said, we've got to start a new company. We're going to make a company. This would be the ideal product for that company. So we started a company called Micro Instrumentation and Telemetry Systems. And in 1975, 5 years later, Ed Roberts designed the Altair 8800, the first real successful hobby computer. And that was published on the cover of Popular Electronics, and that's when the micro revolution really took off. And people began using Altairs as for some of the early electronic music synthesis. And one of the very first ones demonstrated at the Homebrew Computer Club, I believe in San Francisco, was they used a transistor radio placed near the Altair. And the Altair would go through different loops, and you would hear these on the radio, the noise it would make through the radio. And then 1971, going back a few years, Signetics introduced the 550 timer that Hans designed, and that's the famous chip. And then, of course, there's the dual version, the 556. And 1974, I had not heard of the 555 at that time. In 1974, I used a couple of analog audio synthesizer chips to build a gadget I called the Marvelous Martian Music Machine. And I worked with a guy in Albuquerque, and I think we sold maybe 20 of these, that was it. But they were actually pretty sophisticated synthesizers, and they're very, very small. 1976, I wrote a book called Electronic Music Projects for Radio Shack. And this is where I started finding out that people really enjoyed building the 555, using the 555 in various circuits. And so that book had some 555 projects in it. Now you'll notice this book is printed. It's printed in the conventional sense. But in a few years after that, I won't take it out. Radio Shack had me start doing books that were hand lettered. The editor there, Dave Gunzel, he liked my laboratory notebooks, which were all hand printed. So they had me try a hand-printed book, and the first version of that was called Engineer's Notebook. Engineer's Notebook sold 650,000 copies, and so Radio Shack decided we want more hand-lettered books, and which I was glad to write. The first one was written with India ink on Mylar, which was quite a painful process. And then so I shifted to a 7/10 millimeter mechanical pencil, and all the subsequent Radio Shack books that were hand-lettered were written with a pencil. And meanwhile, I was publishing columns in Popular Electronics. I had 3 columns at a time, and I would hit electronic music every several months with a different project. In 1986, I built an analog, actually it was an op-amp with a feedback circuit that allowed me to simulate the sound of an explosion. So I built the electronic explosion synthesizer for Jokes at Bomb, and I was promoting a book at the time, a memoir called Cellular Connections, and the promotion people took me to the Johnny Carson show, and they were really interested in that device, but they were not really interested in me. So they kept the device, and he demonstrated on his program that night. And then we heard several of you talking about surface mount electronic components. And I got into that kind of early in the game. Surface mount components are not easy to work with, but once you get the knack of it, they are easy to work. For example, I learned that masking tape is your best friend. You tape this chip down to the circuit board, and then you can solder it. Also, good vision is a good friend, and the right dimensions of solder are your good friend. So I did a lot of surface mount projects. I got into a little bit of music with those. Here we have some keychain devices that make various sounds, flashlights, and so forth. And then here's one that's, this is a voltage indicator. It's got an LM339 quad comparator, which is essentially 4 op amps without feedback resistors. And as the input voltage increases, these LEDs light up in sequence. And then we saw a lot of discussion this afternoon about using various sequencers to activate tone generators. So this approach would work for that. But I want you to look at the tiny size of these components. They're really small. That's why it looks a little bit sloppy. And trying to solder these by hand is not easy. Here's a business card. And this is just an actual size 3-inch wide business card. And it has a 555 chip in the center. And it has 17 contacts, little push buttons there, you might say. And so you could play up to 17 notes on this. And there's a piezoelectric disc on the upper right, and then there was a lithium battery cell on the back side. So then I had my little business card, but it was too fragile to use. The conductive ink, if you bent the card, of course, that would alter the frequency as well. So you had dual ways of changing the tones. There's the piezo disc. And then here's the engineer's notebook. This is that first hand-lettered book I mentioned to you. This book was designed to show customers at Radio Shack how to work with digital and analog ICs. And so we went through and started with the very primitive circuits using AND gates, NAND gates, and so on. Then we worked up through decoders, and we had the 4017 decade decoder, counter decade decoder. Very, very popular. Some of you are using that. Saw some slides just a few minutes ago using the 4017. And then I did a little circuit called the sound synthesizer. And I reasoned that since the 555 has an extra input that nobody ever uses, maybe we could modulate the output of the 555 by playing around with that input. So I built, and here's the circuit that appears in the book. And so I built a circuit using that. And here's a built-up version of that. This is not the one I built at the time, but you can make these they're very easy to make. You can make it for a few dollars. And then somebody changed the name. I call it the sound synthesizer. In one of my books or articles, I call it a step tone generator. And then these folks called Caustic.net called it the Atari Punk Console. And then all of a sudden, that name, my names were kind of boring. This name changed everything, and people started building this. I started getting, not at this time because email wasn't available, but a little bit later I started getting emails from different people around the country, in fact in other countries, talking about the Atari Punk Console. Here's the circuit. It's the same one from that book. And most people play with it by changing the resistances. By the way, this is the pin 5 is the output pin. Normally pin 3 on a 555, and then pin 8 is a trigger pin. And so you're simply taking the output of the first oscillator and feeding that to the second one. That's how you achieve these interesting effects. But most people change the frequencies by changing one or both of these potentiometers. But don't forget, you've got 2 capacitors. So you can also change the sound sequences by using those, changing those capacitors. And here, so we have a built-up version. And I've got a little flashlight here because it's kind of dark. And there's a... So you see the idea of the step tone, but putting your finger over a photodiode like that is a little awkward, and so I took a ballpoint pen and I put the photodiode, or it's actually a cadmium sulfide photoresistor, into the ballpoint pen, and then we can flick a switch down here. And do the same thing. And then we can look at things in nature and see if there's any sound effects there. And it turns out there are. You saw some really, really interesting sound effects a while ago with even water. I had not seen that done before. I study tree rings. I've gotten into science quite a bit. And this is a 100-year-old, actually, let's see what, this began growing in 1890 as a ball cypress tree growing on the Guadalupe River in Texas. And a big flood washed a lot of these trees down. And what I'm studying is the tannin distribution in the rings of the tree. And so let's see if we can get a little sound out of that. And I think we can, but it's... I'm going to have to hold it this way. I can't, the lighting isn't sufficiently good up here to show you exactly how it works, but you can play the rings. And another way you can play the rings is instead of using a light source, you can actually digitize it. And I have a YouTube. If you go to YouTube Mims, and you can find that circuit. Now there's the on the left there is your potentiometer that controls one of the frequencies, the steps, and then the oscillator is on the right. And let's see, let me go back. And then you can see the photoresistors, the right. This is just one of the lab kits I built for Radio Shack. And here's using an optical fiber probe. Instead of using the cat sulfide cell in the pin there, I use an optical fiber probe. This is a ring of a very hard wood called bodark. It's the hardest wood in North America. It has beautiful rings. And then here's the optical fiber probe. It's just a fiber attached to a piece of plastic there with the cadmium sulfide cell is inside that. Now, if any of you use cadmium sulfide photoresistors, I was telling Mark a while ago, they're being banned because they contain cadmium. Cadmium's a toxic metal, but they contain hardly any cadmium. But our government doesn't realize that, so they're going to ban these things. So stock up now. Here's using the probe to look at tree rings on my telephone, and that leads to another idea. And the idea being that if here we have an audience, and let's say that, and we're going to look at some YouTubes here in a second, but let's say that you have placards, and they're different colors. Let's say red, yellow, green, blue, and so forth. And let's say you want to be in the band, but you're in the audience, and the band's up here. How can you be in the band? Well, you rate your placard in a way, if you do it in an appealing enough manner, the conductor can simply take his probe, he's got a video camera looking at you, and he can select you in the audience, and every time you whack that placard down, all of a sudden you're playing one of the drums. And he can switch that to other instruments, but drums would be the easiest. And so you have an audience that's actually playing the music in the band. So you have a few band members, and when their instrument's being played, they sit down or they move away while the audience takes over. And you can take a whole string of people doing that. So go with that. That's an idea. I'm not a musician myself, but that's an idea I'd like to see implemented someday. Now let's go to the YouTube and see if I can. Okay, I'm using a light to see my screen. And here we go. Now I should be hooked up to the Wi-Fi here. And I'll show you some segments of these YouTubes. There's 3 different ones. Did anybody fly to get here? Anybody? Okay, a bunch of you. Okay, that's good. I'm going to put a little scare into you. This is the cosmic ray background count as you're flying in an aircraft. And the count on the ground is typically around 11 counts. Now it's going to be sound in a minute here. So we're in San Antonio, Texas. San Antonio, right there. Now we're flying 35,000 feet. Right here. Background count can be up to 400% per minute. Now we're descending. We're landing. Now we're in Atlanta. And then we continue. We're going to go to Zurich. I'm not going to play the whole thing. But the idea is, here I kind of like that sound. But when you've got a real Geiger counter on the airplane and the flight attendants here, they get really concerned and nervous. They're not mad, but they're nervous because pilots have been checked for their impact of cosmic rays on them, but the flight attendants have never done any scientific studies, so they'll ask questions and things like that. Let's go to the next one. forgot to get out of that one. Oh, we have two superimposed, but that's okay. You're kind of an eclectic crowd. Now, I measure the atmosphere where I live in Texas. And I've been doing this for 24 and a half years. Ultraviolet, the ozone layer. So that's the ultraviolet for 1 full year. And if you have a friend who's blind, you might want to show that to them. And so I do that, and I have, so for us, there's the sky. And each tone is reflected by the position of the sun in the sky. Now, that's summer. Notice the effect of clouds. Okay, now they're coming down in the fall. And this program is called Music Algorithms. It's online. Unfortunately, there's a bug in that program. But you can digitize any type of data, any numbers, the stock market, your speed in your car, your heart rate, you can digitize that. Okay, now here's I have another version of that has different instruments, but I'm going to go ahead and stop this and go to the last one. Oh, this is where I'm changing the instrument as it plays. But I think you've heard enough, so we'll go to the next one. And this will be the last one here. Okay, this is a tree ring. I hope, yeah. This is the tree cross-section I showed you, but it's been digitized. This is not being done optically. So I put some statistics into this. I'm looking at the early wood that starts growing in the spring, the late wood, which is the summer growth, then I'm putting in a factor for the tannin distribution in the tree. The tannin protects the tree from insects. So in the late wood, that's in the late summer, it deposits a thick layer of tannin, so that in the wintertime, insects can't get in and damage the tree. And you can see this wood over here is really dark. That's called the hardwood. This is the fresh wood. And the reason the center of some trees doesn't rot is because it's so full of tannin that no insects will eat it. So you can hear there's 2 up to 3 tones per ring. Almost over. That's enough. I can't turn off my computer and I can't see the keyboard. All right. The next thing I'm doing is an angular eclipse of the sun. And so you have an angular eclipse photograph, and I made the photograph with a pinhole camera, so it's a beautiful photograph with reds and yellows. In the middle is black. And so I digitize across the image so the blind person would hear a low tone, and then the higher frequencies, and then higher, and then back totally low again in the darkness of the shadow, and then back to the edge of the sun again, hear the high tone. So this would enable a blind person to see an eclipse, I say see an eclipse in a completely different way that we would not appreciate, but they might. So there's lots of things you can do with music algorithms and simple circuits. It's fantastic to be with a group that realizes that micros are important, but don't forget analog electronics. The only way we input anything into a micro from the analog world is through analog electronics, not digital electronics. It's been good to meet with you. Thank you.
that concludes the program. You may have seen on the schedule that I was going to be conducting a workshop after this. As it turns out, if you look at online, you find out that I'm giving it tomorrow at 10 a.m. and it's making a touch-sensitive switch. And we will have all the materials there for you to build a switch where you can turn an LED off and on just by touching some conductive ink. So that will be at the Asheville Museum of Art, I believe. And so I'll be doing that from 10 to 11. Thank you so much for joining us. I think this was a terrific program. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. And enjoy the rest of Moogfest.